Hello, beautiful people, and welcome, to the Chiori pre-release analysis. I procrastinated on doing this for a while, so the video is coming out a bit later than it usually does. I'm sorry about that. We're not using Project Amber anymore, but I do want to correct something I said in the previous video. I did pin a comment correcting myself, but I know not everyone reads the comments, so Project Amber is not, the devs aren't discontinuing support. They're just not going to be supporting leaks anymore. Like, they won't be updating for leak stuff, but they will still be updating with the game. And they've actually also fixed a few UX bugs, as well as added some features recently, like the Spiral Abyss, where you can see everything that's in the Abyss, as well as how much HP they have on all the floors. Still very pog, but unfortunately I won't be able to use it for my pre-release videos anymore. To look at the kit, we're gonna have to use another website to browse the leaks. Anyways, normal attack is pretty normal. As we're gonna get into later, with the skill you can get a Geo Infusion, so the scalings kind of matter. 90%, 86, 55.9 times 2, 138, it's on level 9. We can compare this to another character that's like, I guess Kutsing would be like the best comparison, another sword user. As you can see, the scalings are relatively similar, a little bit higher maybe. The charge attack is a lot lower though. Basically, nothing really extraordinary about these scalings, and she also doesn't have anything in her kit that significantly buffs her attacks directly, which means that her Geo Infusion is effectively just a cosmetic little thing. It's not actually real. Elemental skill. Dashes nimbly forward with silken steps. Once the dash ends, Chiori will summon the automaton doll Sode beside her and sweep her blade upward, dealing AoE geo damage to nearby opponents based on her attack and defense. Holding the skill will cause it to behave differently. Hold, enter aiming mode. It doesn't actually, it just means you can hold it to aim. The doll will slash at nearby opponents at interval, dealing AoE geo damage. It's every 3.6 seconds. You get a total of 5 hits per doll. While active, if there are nearby geoconstructs, or if geoconstructs are created nearby, which looks repetitive, but it's basically a way to say if there are when you use it, or if you generate one after using it, you generate an additional Sode, so another doll gets generated, will be summoned next to your active character. Only one additional Sode can be summoned in this manner, and its duration is independently counted. In other words, she has an off-field geo ability that hits 5 times, and if you have a geoconstruct, instead, it hits 10 times. Now, I've talked about this in my first impressions video. I think it's a good idea to be trying to bring Geo in the direction of interacting with the kits of other Geo characters, and how I think it's nice to try to focus on constructs, but that it also isn't necessarily the best way to go about it. I mean, obviously, if you've ever played Albedo or Zhongli, you know that their constructs can get destroyed very easily. There are constructs that cannot get destroyed easily, like Ushi, right? Ito's elemental skill. Ushi is considered a construct, and it doesn't, like, if the boss moves into it, he doesn't get destroyed. And I think that in a world where there's a lot of geoconstructs like Ushi, things that encourage the use of geoconstructs with geo characters, it's a good direction to take Geo. However, Chiori doesn't encourage you to have multiple geoconstructs, she just encourages you to have one, and doesn't reward you for having more than one. And then on top of that, we don't have a lot of choices for units that can create constructs right now. Now, I do want to talk about how, like, the ways they could use this design direction to revitalize Geo and give it a new breath of fresh air, a breath of life. And how, even though she's effectively, right, she's a skill damage dealer that deals all field damage, which is very similar to Albedo. And as we're going to get into, her numbers are basically just better than Albedo. But it's not even necessarily direct power creep, because her dolls aren't considered constructs. And if they do keep designing Geo units with the idea of, you know, Geo's reaction, it doesn't really do much, right? The crystallized shards don't do too much. A lot of Geo units are designed to work with other Geo units. If they keep going in that direction with Geo constructs, they can effectively have creating a construct as the condition, and you can give units payoffs if you have constructs or based on the amount of constructs you have. And if you do that, then Albedo having a construct would be an upside that Chiori doesn't have. And so if you make other Geo units that give you payoffs for having constructs, those units might work better with Albedo than they do with Chiori, even though Chiori just has effectively better numbers. That being said, that's a big if, right? That's if they do that, and we don't know if they will, right? That's the reality. right now, in the current state of the game, I don't really see a reason to use Albedo over her in effectively any team. I hope that's the direction they take. I think that if they do, this is a really cool idea. I don't think that right now Chiori's kit is all that interesting though, without those other units existing that can give you payoffs for geoconstructs. But that's just my thoughts on her design, and obviously she's more than just her gameplay design. So let's get into the numbers and all the other good stuff. So the elemental skill, when you use it initially, it will do 254% of attack, 317% of defense. So she's a split scaler slash dual scaler slash whatever you want to call it. I think that a lot of people not necessarily misunderstand, but split scalers get a bad name because when a bad unit has split scaling, people blame them being bad on the split scaling. And when a good unit has split scaling, people pretend like it's a different thing that isn't split scaling. And so I would advise people not to get so taken aback by the split scaling. What sort of effects does the split scaling have on Chiori? The biggest effect that it has is that it makes it so that crit and damage percent, they become a lot more significant compared to defense or attack than they are on other units. Now you might think, oh, but crit and damage percent are always more important than... Shut up. No, they're not. There's a reason why people don't play Harbinger on Ayaka. The consequence that this has is it makes weapons like Harbinger a lot stronger. And as we're going to see when we get into the weapons, the base attack being lower on Harbinger matters less because there's a defense scaling, but also the weapons that give defense, like Cinnabar, don't give you quite as much because there's an attack scaling. And that makes it so that in a lot of situations, Chiori's best free-to-play option is going to be Harbinger. One thing that I haven't mentioned yet is that her skill doesn't snapshot, which means that unlike a character like Albedo, he can't take advantage of Goro's buffs all that well. That does mean that the difference between the two is going to be smaller in Mono Geo teams than it is in Navia teams. So in Navia teams, she is more of an upgrade to Albedo, and she can't snapshot Bennett's buff either, unfortunately. Anyways, moving on to the burst. Twin blades leave their sheaths as Chiori slices with the clean cuts of a master tailor, dealing AoE geo damage based on her attack and defense. These numbers used to be a lot higher. Like, this used to be like 800% defense or 700 something. Now it's 545. The damage from the old got cut down by like 30%. Her burst was alright, but it wasn't really worth losing stat to build the ER to get it every rotation. Now it's like barely worth using at all. Like you use it if it's available. It's very similar to Albedo's burst, where it's just not that great. It's not completely useless, right? Like you will. It also looks nice, right? If you've seen any of the animations, it looks nice, and that's cool. But you know, stuff like this, 5-star burst animations tend to be on the longer side, especially compared to the 4 stars. And using them, it makes your rotations longer, and so the damage that you're getting out of it isn't free, right? It comes at the cost of time, and when how strong units are in a game is dictated by DPS checks, damage coming at the cost of time isn't as big of an upside as it seems when you see a big number on your screen. And so her burst is still worth using if it's up, but honestly, barely. And you definitely don't want to build ER and lose damage on your E just to make sure you get your burst every rotation. If you burst every other rotation, it's fine. The biggest upside of it is that it's a pretty large AoE. Then we get into the passives, and yeah, I miss Project Amber already, man. Layout mobile, #tap, layout PC, #press. So, gain different effects based on the next action you take after using your skill. Basically, after you use your skill, you can either use your skill again or use your normal attack. Kind of like Nilo, I guess, but only once. If you use the normal attack, you get a Geo Infusion. If you use the skill, it switches to the next character in your roster. So you're going to want to actually put her on a specific slot on your roster so that it automatically switches to the next character you want to swap into. And grants all your party members a buff. Well, it's not really a buff, but a status effect. And when you swap, it makes it so that up to twice per using your skill, you can trigger a coordinated attack from your dolls when you use a normal charge or plunge attack. And the coordinated attack is the same as the initial damage of the upward sweep, which is bigger than the damage from the dolls attacking generally. And so effectively, you get 2 additional instances of the upward sweep damage. So, looking at a rotation, what are you going to get over your rotation? You're going to get 3 instances of the upward sweep, and then 5 instances of the soak damage. And then if you're playing with a Geo Construct, instead you're gonna get 10 instances of the soak damage. And finally, Ascension 4 passive. When a party member creates a Geo Construct, Chiori will gain 20% Geo damage. And then I guess, yeah, the most important part of the kit, the Exploration passive. When any party member is wearing an outfit apart from their default outfit, or is wearing a wind glider other than the default one, your party members will obtain 10% move speed, but it doesn't work in Abyss. Anyways, overall, think of her this way. If you don't get the Geo Construct from this, she's kind of a slight Albedo upgrade in the sense that her damage is relatively similar to Albedo, but she has the huge quality of life upgrade of not having a construct that can break, but it's not a significant increase in terms of actual DPS. If you are getting a construct, then she is a relatively sizable upgrade to Albedo. I think that generally she's going to be played either in Navia teams or you don't get the second doll, and she's still, you know, a potential quality of life upgrade to Albedo and still pretty good. Or you're going to play her in Ito teams or maybe some other form of Mono Geo, but it's really mainly the Ito teams where she is a relatively significant upgrade to Albedo. Albedo in those teams already kind of struggled to justify his place. He was barely better than non-Geo fourth options, characters like Yelan, even when you're not getting a lot of exquisite throws because Ito does a lot of charge attacks. We're already like somewhat competitive, and so, you know, it definitely is an upgrade over him. That being said, you can still play with Albedo. You can still play a 4 Geo core with something like Itogoro, Chiori, Albedo. Now, if you do that, you don't have a shield, but against any sort of elemental enemies, you can get crystallized shields. And the reason why the shield matters isn't just because, well, defensive utility is nice, although it is. It's that without a shield, you can't proc Geo Resonance, and without Geo Resonance, you lose out on a lot of damage because of the lack of the resistance shred, and obviously the damage percent. But it's really the resistance shred that makes a big difference. I think that from what I've seen, the overall team DPS was relatively similar, assuming you didn't get a shield, between using Albedo as the last slot and using Zhongli, and it was better if you're getting a crystallized shield. But obviously, you're playing without defensive utility, and a lot of people won't want to do that. So I'd still generally recommend using Zhongli over Albedo as the fourth slot with something like Itogoro and her. And then I want to very quickly, usually I do the Constellation stuff later on, but I want to very quickly touch on the C1. C1 makes the AoE of your doll increase by 50%, which doesn't even matter that much because the AoE is so small, and increasing an incredibly small AoE is just going to be pretty small instead of incredibly small, but it's still f***ing small. And on top of that, you basically always get 2 dolls whether you're playing with a Geo Constructs or not. It's range, not AoE, is it? Ah, okay. My bad then. That's kind of nice then. Thank you, chat. It's not that big of a deal unless enemies are moving a lot, though, because I think the range is already somewhat decent. Shouldn't be that big of a deal. Anyways, yeah, you get the second doll no matter what, but only if you have another Geo character. So you still want to play her with another Geo character, but it doesn't need to be a Geo character with a construct anymore. And honestly, I'm going to be honest with you guys, this is such a bait constellation. She's already side grade 2 upgrade in Navia teams. Personally, ever since I playtested Navia, I've been of the mind that Navia's best Geo teammate, if you don't need the defensive utility provided by Zhongli, is Geo MC, not Albedo. She is a side grade to upgrade to Albedo, and I think that she's probably better than Geo MC at C0. So like she's still pretty good with Navia. This is a constellation that makes her much better with Navia. Also, when you're playing her with any other Geo character, it does fucking nothing. But yeah, so keep in mind, basically the way you can look at this is slightly better than an average C1 if you're playing her with Navia, and significantly worse if you're playing her without Navia. But she doesn't need this to be played with Navia. She's still a very competitive option for Navia's teams without this. But yeah, the amount that you gain from the C1 with the Navia teams, it's not actually double the damage. Just because you get 2 dolls doesn't mean you're getting double the damage, because you're not getting an increase on the amount of coordinated attacks you're getting from the Ascension 1 passive, or the amount of damage you're getting from your burst. And so it's closer to like a 50, maybe a little bit more percent damage increase, depending on the weapon, obviously. But around that ballpark. And it is obviously pretty big, but keep in mind, this is a an off-fielder that is not doing the majority of your team's damage. So a 50-ish% damage increase is far from 50% team DPS increase. Like in terms of your team DPS, it's like closer to a 10% DPS increase. But anyways, point being, I've seen a lot of people say that like, oh yeah, like it's very clearly you have to pull for her C1 if you want to play her with Navia. And I really just want to emphasize that you do not have to go for it. It will make her stronger in Navia teams, but she is still a good unit for Navia teams without it. Please don't feel like you have to get any Constellations. Other Constellations, very quickly, for 10 seconds after using the burst, you get an additional doll every 3 seconds. It attacks nearby opponents, dealing AoE geo damage equal to 1.7 times your default doll damage. So it's basically the equivalent of an additional doll, because you get 3 times 1.7, which is 5.1 times a doll damage, and the doll usually hits 5 times. So it's basically you get an additional doll from the burst. It's not actually just an additional doll because you only get it when you burst, and without the C2 you don't necessarily use your burst every rotation. C3 skill levels pretty good. C4 for 8 seconds after triggering your Ascension 1, you can effectively trigger the Ascension 1 again, but this time summon the C2 doll, and you get another 3. So basically, if I'm understanding this correctly, C4 is just C2 again, so you get basically an additional doll worth. C5 increases burst scaling, it's really bad. C6, after triggering the Ascension 1, her skill cooldown decreases by 12 seconds. Baseline is 16 seconds, so it becomes 4 seconds cooldown. In addition, her normal attacks damage is increased by an amount equal to 235% of her own defense. So effectively, she gets a 235% defense scaling on her normal attacks, and her E cooldown gets significantly reduced when you trigger the follow-up. But you do still get the follow-up attacks when you're attacking on her. It's not just when other characters use normal charge and plunge attacks. Anyways, point being, her C6 is effectively, it makes her an on-fielder. So, in other words, C1 plus 1 doll in Navia teams plus literally nothing in any other team. Her C2 is plus 1 doll. Her C3 is skill damage or doll damage. Her C4 is plus 1 doll. Her C5 is nothing. And her C6 can make her an on-fielder. Now, when it comes to her weapons, it's actually really straightforward. If you're playing her in any team that doesn't use Farina, ideally any team that also has some form of shielding, so to make sure she doesn't get hit, Harbinger is generally her best option when it comes to free-to-play weapons. If you are using a team that is using Farina, although I think generally that isn't even going to happen that much, then it's basically just any default sword. The Wolf Fang is fine. Some of you might be surprised to see Harbinger being recommended over Cinnabar. So let's talk about Cinnabar very quickly. From the footage I've seen, it seems like the way that her second doll is hitting is a little bit after the first one, while Cinnabar passive is still on cooldown. They don't hit at the same time, so they can't both benefit from the buff, right? Because if you're hitting within 0.1 seconds, so at the same time, they could both get the buff. Otherwise, it would have to be 1.5 second interval between the two because it has a 1.5 second cooldown. And from what I've seen, that doesn't seem to be the case. There might be some setups, and obviously can't really know that until we do some testing. There might be some setups that reliably get you the dolls hitting at intervals that are 1.5 seconds apart, because the doll is hitting every 3.6 seconds, which means that 2 dolls, if you time them properly, could hit every 1.8 seconds. But that's not something I'm going to be assuming for now. Just know that if that is the case, then Cinnabar does become her best option. One thing I do want to add is that if you are playing her in Navia teams, Cinnabar actually becomes a lot better, because the downside of Cinnabar is that it only procs on some of the doll hits. But if you don't have 2 dolls, if you only have 1, then, well, Cinnabar is still you're still getting the same amount of Cinnabar hits, but you're getting less damage from the rest of your kit, which comparatively makes Cinnabar a better option. Which means that in the teams where you're not getting as much defense Mono Geo stuff, the Mono Geo weapon is better than in the teams where you are, which is very funny to me. Cinnabar Spindle is going to be generally the best in slot free to play for Navia teams. I know that a lot of people don't have it because it's pretty old at this point. It's an event weapon. If you don't have it, generally, you unfortunately just don't have a great alternative if you're playing in a team where you can't use Harbinger. Like, Festering is fine, but it's not great. Wolf Fang, it's fine. It can be competitive at high Constellation, or at high refinement with Harbinger. And obviously, if you're playing with Farina, then it's better. Wolfang isn't that great because the passive, as far as I'm aware, can't proc off field. So because you want to swap out after using your E, you don't get to actually stack it. You only get 2% crit rate. And the passive doesn't last that long. It lasts 10 seconds, and her doll lasts for longer than that, so you don't even get full uptime on it. So you get one stack with low uptime, so it's just not that great. But it's still skill and burst damage on a crit rate main stat, which means that it's a decent option. Otherwise, Finale of the Deep, fine, free-to-play option if you don't have Spindle and you're playing in a team where you can't get good Harbinger uptime. Other than that, obviously there's the 5-star weapons. Basically all of the crit stat stakes are within 5% of Harbinger of Dawn, either above or below. Generally it's like 1 or 2% difference. They're effectively Harbinger equivalents that you can use if you have Farina. Like, that's basically it. J Cutter is a little bit above the other ones at about 7% ahead, so if you have that you can use it. The other ones are like very small difference. And then obviously her signature, it's better than Harbinger by about 25%, which is relatively average for a signature. But keep in mind, she's a support, so she's not doing the majority of the team's damage, or she's an off-fielder, she's not doing the majority of your team's damage, so a signature weapon on her doesn't do as much as it does on a carry. Next, artifact sets. And really, there's two, and there's only two. Golden Troop and Husk. They're a single-digit % difference that can go up to like a little bit over 5%, depending on the weapons. Golden Troop is generally ahead of Husk. I would say, generally, if you're farming Husk anyways, because you're going for a good Ito set, then, you know, you can use whatever leftover Husk. Otherwise, generally, Golden Troop is the better of the two set by a little bit, and it's in a domain that's useful for a lot of teams with Marie-José. So I think that Golden Troop is generally going to be the thing you want to go for. But if you're playing her in Mono Geo, you might already have some really good Husk pieces. Yeah, if you're bursting every rotation, Husk becomes a little bit better, but not even by that much. Next up, artifact stats. Generally, you're going to be going for defense, damage, crit. Or defense geo crit. The one thing I will say is that I know a lot of people don't keep their defense sense because they get angry looking at them. I understand. I truly do. And attack sense are behind by about 2 to 3 substats worth, but it's fine if you're using an attack sense. She does scale better with defense than she does with attack, but she does still scale with attack. So if you have a really good attack sense and no defense sense, you can use that. It's not the end of the world, but you should try to get a defense sense because it will be like at equal substats, it's about a 5 to 6% damage increase to get a defense sense. You can also run a defense goblet, or I mean, at this point, even an attack goblet to some extent. If you're running with Farina, because you're oversaturating on damage percent a lot, in a perfect world, you'd be able to run a crit goblet, but unfortunately, that's not a thing. Generally, though, right, you want to be aiming for defense geo crit. With Farina, it's not that bad to go defense crit. So this is the general recommendation. You can go defense crit, fine with Farina, attack, geo, crit, cope, but fine, and defense geo crit is best in slot. And then finally, the teams. We have Mono Geo, we have Navia, and we have cope. These are the three ways you can play her. You can play her in Mono Geo with Ito, you can play her as the second Geo unit with Navia, or you can cope. The thing is, if you're coping, it's not that bad. Like, she's not that bad when you're coping. You can play her in other teams, just like you can play Albedo in other teams. At the end of the day, if you're playing her without a construct, she is still a slightly better Albedo. And just like you can put Albedo in any team and he'll be whatever, you could put her in any team and she'll be whatever. But yeah, so like if you really like Chiori and you don't have Navia or Ito, it doesn't mean that you won't be able to play her. It just means that the teams where you will play her just won't necessarily be optimal. You can still slot her into any functional 3-unit core and she'll do fine, but they're definitely not teams where she's gonna shine. I say this with love. I play a lot of cope teams. It doesn't make it so that I'm not coping, but coping is fine. Sometimes coping is fun. But yeah, that's basically it, really. All in all, I think she's gonna be a pretty good unit. She's relatively limited in terms of the teams where she's good, but she is an upgrade in Mono Geo teams, and she is ranging between a side grade and an upgrade in Navia teams. I don't think she's worth pulling for to improve your Navia team over if you already have GeoMC or Albedo or Zhongli pulling for Navia's weapon or pulling for Constellations or whatever. If all you care about is making that team stronger, you won't see as much returns from her as you would from other ways you could spend your wishes. But if you like her, she's definitely a unit you can go for, and she will work in Navia teams. That basically does it. So I hope you guys enjoyed the pre-release, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube. But yeah, another thing I want to add is I said I would get into the reasons why the pre-release got delayed. I ended up procrastinating on the pre-release a lot because the initial leaks, her E snapshotted, and then they removed the snapshot from her E, which I thought was disappointing because it made her work worse with Goro. And I was like, bro, why would they do that? And then they nerfed her burst, which was also disappointing because her burst was already barely worth using. At the end of the day, right, it's not that she's bad, it's just Ohoyo hates her, man. I don't know what else to say. I think that's how they're trying to fight leaks. They're making it so that every single beta change is a disappointment so that people stop looking forward to leaks. I think that's their plan. But that's why I ended up procrastinating on it a lot. My bad.